This discussion is about your corporate brand. Building your corporate brand as a strategic asset might take a lifetime. You start small with product brands, and then over time you become a massively valuable corporate brand like a Unilever or HSBC or a John Keel's. Now, in that process, you will find time to time your corporate brand might lose its relevance, or there might be an opportunity that your corporate brand has to embrace. As a result, you might need to make some changes to your brand identity. You might need to tinker around with your brand identity, or sometimes you might have to take radical decisions to make a total overhaul of your corporate brand identity. Because this brand that you build is going to be at the heart of your overall reputation. So, with that in mind, this task, which is task 2.B and C of your CDC assignment for 2019, is requiring you to come up with an outline strategy, not just to do the rebranding, but to engage your employees in this rebranding process. Now, this is somewhere most companies fail because they fail to get their biggest brand ambassadors, their employees, involved, engaged, and to buy in to their rebranding process. Remember, employees are the ones who are most linked to that brand, and you want to make a change, you've got to ensure they are on board with you. Now, how do you start this process? Especially with this task, you need to have a introduction, which is a context that needs to be set before you do the plan. So at the start of the task, you will want to bring in the current context of your brand identity. What are the key issues? So that you will bring from your audits, some of the things you've discussed in the earlier tasks. Importantly, you'll bring the employee context. Where are the key issues? Where are the key strengths? Now, the employee perception was discussed in task 1.B. The degree of interaction, where there are positives and negatives, were discussed in task 2B or 1B. And then in 2A, you discuss the cultural interface with your potential rebranding. And these aspects would help you to set the platform of your key issues. In other words, come up with your context analysis. There onwards, you could go on setting up your outline strategy for employee engagement in your rebranding. Now, at the start of this, makes sense to prioritize your stakeholders. So that's a key heading. You prioritize stakeholders in your communications. Now, that is easy because you already done the discussions, and now you would really put a clear metrics and prioritize which stakeholder groups, which internal stakeholder groups are you going to prioritize. And you might also want to indicate any external stakeholder groups who also need to be part of this. So that justification, why do you say that? That recommendation has to be clearly set, which is at a start. The second part of any plan is to set your objectives. Now, here you have to set your rebranding objectives. Example, you might want to reposition this brand, or you might want to strengthen the current strategic positioning. For example, Kiehl's did not change their brand positioning. In fact, they strengthened the fresh aspect of their brand, which was there before as well. But now they've put more purpose towards it and align their overall brand identity. So set the objectives one by one, 3 to 4 objectives. And remember, couple of those objectives have to be employee related objectives, employee engagement related objectives. So very important to get this right. Now there onwards, you will need to bring out your recommendations on any identity change, visual identity change or a communicated identity change. Are you doing the Kiehl's on it? Which means you are also looking at a logo change. Kiehl's dropped super out of Kiehl's super to make it Kiehl's. They made clearly some color changes to make the logo more sustainable, as well as but they kept their they didn't come up with major taglines and etc. In fact, they don't have a tagline or a payoff line like Cargill's has. So, what is the recommendation for your identity change? And importantly, what's your recommendation to get employees engaged in that identity change? Now, look at case studies of companies who've done that well and also support that through theory. So, what are your identity recommendations and related employee engagement recommendations? The third dimension this outline could also be your communication strategy recommendations. So, are you recommending a particular CSR communication strategy? Are you changing your CSR platform from, let's say, entrepreneurship support that you used to do to maybe environmental initiatives that you want to move towards? Example again in Keels, we see them strategically taking up the recycling, reusing environmental initiative because that is directly linked to the business they are in. Because they are in FMCG, they are into a lot of packaging. They are also one of the biggest polluters as a supermarket. And they are now really focusing on an area that they can be seen relevant. Are you making such a change? Now, how do you engage employees? Is there an example or a case study that you could use how employees are engaged in CSR? Example, how do you get employee volunteerism up? So there are enough reading on it. In fact, John Keels itself recognizes employee volunteerism and they have a measure for that. So what are your specific communication recommendations, including CSR communication, your storytelling? Maybe you're looking at a strategic sponsorships for your company going forward to help the new brand identity. Think on those lines and make your recommendations very, very clearly. So these are some examples of what are your strategic initiatives in this employee engagement for your rebranding. 3 to 4, 5 maximum would help you set up a very clear outline. I've also talked about a final point on some of the critical success factors for effective employee rebranding initiative. Think about that. That could be something you could develop. We could have a chat on this. First of all, get the basic outline right, and maybe that could be a little cherry on your cake that makes your work go to another level. Now, any great plan needs monitoring to see whether it's on track. So your task 2C is about how to monitor that this plan is on track. So whenever you are going to look at an organization, its reputation and its brand, there are some models that you could use. There are some commercial tools you could use. I outlined that in the guidance note below. But a start to this task, 2C, could be about highlighting the importance of closely monitoring any changes you do to an intangible asset like a corporate brand. Because you might want to, let's say the classic example of Keels. On one side, Keels is talking about fresh in everything they do. Everything around the brand identity, the visual identity, the communicated identity, your behaviors, they all align towards supporting fresh. But on the other hand, they're also talking about environment, recycling. So how if you overdo one of them or underdo it, you might see suddenly your positioning gets dragged into an area that you don't want to. So you got to monitor your rebranding initiatives very closely. And in this case, you have to monitor whether the employees are changing in their attitude towards the brand identity that you are trying to create. Are they getting engaged? So how do you do that is going to be the discussion here. So once again, to start the task 2C, talk about the importance of monitoring a brand in a rebranding process, importance of monitoring employees in such a process, bring out the theory, bring out a case study, and so that we are very clear. The second part of the task, you could showcase your knowledge about the tools and techniques available to monitor such initiatives. I've listed a fair bit. In your textbook on measuring reputation, there are many tools available to measure your corporate reputation, your brand identity, and the communications. So bring some of those tools and showcase what's available. I've talked about even a RepTrek, which measures reputation, as areas of measuring the workplace. So likewise, getting into measures like your best places to work, has those ranks improved? Right down to measuring your communications. You had a storytelling recommendations. What's the degree of employee engagement in that storytelling? Are the employees' perception changing? How do you monitor whether your storytelling is in the right direction? So look at some of the tools available. I might even look at a table to list down the tools, look at some of the positives and challenges and the relevance to figuring out employee engagement. After I set my tool mix, I will go to my serious recommendation, which is at the end of the task, the last part, the big area. So 2/3 of your work has to now come in this area. So you could decide what specific tool or technique you are going to use to monitor. So example, if your strategy had a lot to do with your new storytelling, then you want to use a storytelling monitoring mechanism. What type of focus groups, what type of perception tracking tools that you could use in your storytelling monitoring. That will be a great recommendation. At the same time, you might want to recommend a digital tool that helps to monitor the internal perceptions, changes, degree of engagement of employees. So I brought in this tool, which is a connected tool to Salesforce with Chatter, Radian 6, which is an external communication, social media listening tool. So you could build like a digital solution to monitor what's happening internally in your company with regard to the strategy you recommended earlier. So there's a bit of reading about this for you to make this recommendation. So carefully read the guidance below, and that would help you to take this task 2B and C together, though there are two tasks, because the first part of 2B is about the outline strategy, and the last part of the task, which is 2C, is about how to monitor that strategy. So this has to be interconnected and has to have a clear flow. That's your final check to see when somebody reads this, does it actually make sense? It's a serious task. It's at the core of this assignment. Take time to read through, understand. Your questions that you have, please direct at me. We will bring this conversation a couple of times to our classrooms to ensure that we are very clear and we are personally convinced about our own recommendations, and that it will work and it will help improve our employee perceptions about the new rebranding, and it will help achieve better engagement.